Welcome back to the channel. Today I'm going to be discussing Drinking the Sea at Gaza, Days and Nights in a Land Under Siege by Amira Haas. And here's a little close-up of the cover. Amira Haas is an Israeli journalist who's lived in the West Bank, I think, since the late 90s. And just so that I don't mess it up because her background's from all over the place, I'm just going to read straight from Wikipedia what her family background is. She's the daughter of a Bosnian-born Sephardic Jewish mother who survived 9 months in Bergen-Belsen and a Romanian-born Ashkenazi Jewish father. In her own words, her parents were never Zionists, but they found themselves in Israel as refugees after the Holocaust. Frustrated by the events of the First Intifada and by what she considered their inadequate coverage in the Israeli media, she started to report from the Palestinian territories in 1991. This book is a result of that. She lived in Gaza for an extended period of time. This book was published in 1996. As of 2003, she is the only Jewish Israeli journalist who has lived full-time among the Palestinians in Gaza from 1993 to 1997 and in Ramallah since. And she's tried to get back into Gaza since. I think most recently she was in Gaza for a little while and was arrested when she came back to Israel in 2009 for, I don't know, being in an enemy state without a permit or something like that. So as I've had to do with many of these books lately, this is going to be divided into two parts. This first part is going to be about the realities of the occupation. And obviously, there is occupation going on in East Jerusalem and the West Bank. I'm not trying to minimize that, but since the book is Drinking the Sea at Gaza, I'm going to be focusing on the occupation in Gaza as she observed it. So let's get into it. Talking about some Palestinians here. They were sitting in a car when several soldiers suddenly appeared. "Turn off the engine and get out of the car, all of you," they yelled. They ordered us to pick up all the garbage in the street and dump it inside the houses. At first we refused, and they fell on us like a bunch of madmen, hitting us and anyone else who got too close. Ashqar was moved, though, by all the people who risked their safety trying to intervene. They came out of their houses begging the soldiers, "Leave them alone." They said, "We'll take care of it." But the soldiers insisted that we had to do it. The sort of typical bullying. We're going to pick up people in the street, tell them to pick up trash and dump it inside people's houses. The extent of the violence that accompanied the uprising can scarcely be overemphasized. During the first 4 years of the Intifada, 60,706 Gazans were injured by shooting, beating, or tear gas. According to a study by the Association of Israeli and Palestinian Physicians for Human Rights, 2,285 people were shot in 1988, 7,049 were severely beaten, and 3,295 suffered ill effects from inhaling tear gas. In 1989, 6,974 people were shot, 10,774 were beaten, and 3,196 suffered from the effects of tear gas. According to UNRWA records, between August 1989 and August 1993, 1,085 persons treated in its clinics had been shot in the head. 302 of these were between the ages of 17 and 24, 163 of them were women, and 545 were under 16, of whom 97 were children under the age of 6. In its study, the PHR points out that during the 5 years of the Intifada, a child under the age of 6 was shot in the head once every 2 weeks, an appalling statistic. And here are two examples of young children being affected. On February the 2nd, 1989, 6-year-old Lulu Abu Daki from the Shabura refugee camp came home from school, asked for money for ice cream, and went out in the street with a friend. Her father remembers that there was no particular unrest in the area. The streets were quiet. Suddenly, we heard a shot. A few minutes later, Lulu's friend came running back with her ice cream, shouting, "Lulu's dead." She said that some soldiers had come out from a side street. The girls had started running, and Lulu was shot in the head with a rubber bullet. In fact, Lulu was not dead. 7 years later, she was still hospitalized in the West Bank Recuperation Association's facility, totally dependent on those around her. The only voluntary movements she can control are blinking her eyes, chewing, and swallowing. The Israeli army opened an investigation some 2.5 years after Lulu was injured, and only after the family persisted in demanding one, but then announced that the length of time that had passed since the incident made it impossible to ascertain the relevant evidence regarding the actions of IDF forces on the date in question. The file was closed. And that's not an exceptional case. That sort of response happens all the time. The footnote says, Lulu Abu Daki died at home on December 2nd, 1998, her 16th birthday. Rana Abu Tulior, an 11-year-old girl in Khan Yunis, went out to buy milk on December the 19th, 1992, during a 45-minute break in a curfew imposed to prevent demonstrations following Israel's mass deportation of Hamas and Islamic Jihad supporters. That afternoon, a jeep had driven around town announcing the break, the first in 5 days. People were unsure whether only women were allowed outside, as had been true the other times the curfew had been lifted temporarily. So MS, a neighbor, asked Rana to get some milk from Abed al-Shafi Farka, who owned a citrus grove and a few cows. 2 days later, MS painfully described the events. He had given Rana a bottle, and she had set out excitedly for the main street. Although the curfew had been lifted, a number of soldiers and military vehicles were circulating in the neighborhood as the streets filled with people outstretching their legs. 15 minutes later, another neighbor, MR, suddenly heard shooting, and he and others went to see what was happening. MR, and I'm sorry, these are not Arab names, it's M period, R period. Amira is making anonymous, or at least limiting the initials of the people so that they could feel free to tell their stories without retribution. MR saw 4 army jeeps parked near the girls' school close to his house. Some kids were throwing stones at them, and the soldiers were firing in return. MS, too, went out and watched Rana walk towards Farka's house, about 150 yards from the soldiers. He saw her reach the gate, then fall to the ground. Like several others who witnessed what had happened, he tried to go to her but was prevented by the heavy gunfire. Only 15 minutes later, during a lull in the shooting, were they able to rush her to the hospital, where the doctor pronounced her dead on arrival. She had been shot in the back. The army spokesman maintained that when the curfew was lifted, a large number of people of various ages came outside in an organized and deliberate manner, creating a disturbance and throwing rocks and bricks. A number of armed people were observed among those disturbing the peace. All shooting incidents were the result of a clear sense of danger on the part of the IDF forces present. And so we have to be clear that the IDF are threatened by an 11-year-old girl holding a milk bottle trying to get milk. This is a dangerous terrorist who must be killed. This is what the IDF expects us to accept and to believe and to just swallow whole, that an 11-year-old girl out getting milk is a terrorist and presented a threat. I guess a poor Israeli IDF soldier must have felt scared for his life and had to shoot a girl in the back in order to get over his fear, his great fear for his life. What would soldiers do to people's homes? On 3 occasions, I was in different people's homes just after the Israeli army had finished searching for wanted men. The pattern was similar in hundreds of other homes and had nothing to do with the suspect's political affiliation or the gravity of his purported act. A large group of soldiers, possibly accompanied by a Shabak officer or two — Shabak is the secret police of Israel — would break into the house, usually in the middle of the night, but sometimes even in daylight, and let loose an orgy of shooting and destruction, emptying wardrobes and tearing them apart. Conceivably, weapons might be hidden inside. Spraying the thin walls and ceilings with gunfire — there could be a double ceiling. And ripping open mattresses. Ammunition might be concealed in the stuffing. The one thing I could never understand, though, was the ritual destruction of televisions, radios, chairs, beds, and dressing tables, all smashed beyond repair, the mirrors splintered in rage, the telephone wires torn out of the walls with what seemed like infinite hatred. Even those whose homes remained undisturbed had suffered from routine disrespect for Palestinian property. During the Intifada, soldiers were frequently stationed deep in the heart of heavily populated areas as a way of suppressing the uprising. They often set up observation posts on the roofs of people's homes, and there were constantly stories of their smashing the solar heating panels on the rooftops. defecating on the stairs, and making horrendous noise. As a matter of course, the neighborhood children threw stones up at the soldiers, more often breaking windows than hitting their targets. To this day, my friends in Khan Yunis fondly remember the soldier who came down from his post on the roof, leaving his gun behind, and asked to speak to the children. "Look," he said, "I don't like being here, and I want you to know that I'll never shoot at you. But it's a shame to keep throwing stones and breaking your neighbor's windows." So we'll see this again, but there's a little bit of humor inside all of this heartbreak and difficulty. And you'll need it. I have to tell you, it's easy to say. It's a very privileged thing to say. It's very difficult to read these books. But my difficulty, the emotional difficulty in reading these books, doesn't compare to what the Gazans, the Palestinians, the people in the West Bank, the people in East Jerusalem have to deal with. So I'm not trying to complain. I'm just warning you that if you read this book and you are someone who is empathetic to the suffering of others, you may want to either take the book more slowly or just be patient, because there's so much suffering in the book that it may make it hard for you to get through. So just beware. By contrast, the mangled heaps of rubble bear witness to the ravaged lives of Gaza's people, like the rings of a tree trunk marking the passage of time. The demolished homes almost always turn out to have belonged to the families of men accused of what Israelis call acts of terror and Gazans call the struggle against the occupation. The families moved away or dispersed to the homes of relatives or lived next to the piles of rubble for a while, in a tent provided by the Red Cross, before they began to build new houses beside the ruins. The Israeli army has always defended its policy of sealing up houses or demolishing them as a deterrent. The demolition is brutal, usually carried out a few days after the suspect's arrest, long before his guilt or innocence has been established in court. But when a family shows me the pile of ruins 10 or 20 years later, I cannot detect any signs of regret for the deed that caused the demolition, not even when elderly parents and younger sisters are the ones who had to pay the price. So it's clearly a technique that doesn't work and is only one more brick in the resistance that the Gazans put up. And I would say the Palestinians in general, because obviously there's demolitions in the West Bank as well. So there's also the destruction of trade. Sometimes the truckers get as far as their destination, one of the Israeli quarries, for example, where they plan to load up with gravel, but the convoy arrives just as the quarry's shift is changing. The military escort, acting on instructions from the CLO, orders the trucks to return to Gaza rather than wait the half hour for the quarry's work to resume. The CLO has told me, and the CLO is an office from the Israeli side, which authorizes movements to and from Gaza. The CLO has told me that these occasional lapses are caused by a lack of coordination on the Palestinian side, but I have heard of many similar incidents. On one occasion, a shipment of flowers arrived late at the Israeli packing plant after soldiers at the era's checkpoint had held up the convoy, waiting for a green light from their superiors, even though the drivers had all the necessary permits. At the plant, where goods are checked a second time, the inspectors took a break after going over 2 trucks worth of flowers. Instead of waiting, the escort sent the remaining trucks back to Gaza still loaded with flowers. In the end, the growers fed flowers to herds of goats and sold the rest for a shekel a bunch on every Gaza City street corner. Another time, a convoy of citrus was held up on its way to the port of Ashdod, and the ship meant to carry the fruit back to the buyer in Eastern Europe was forced to sail without it. No doubt, the buyer will prefer in future to deal with a Spanish or Israeli company rather than rely on Palestinians. Since Israel imposed the harsh closure of 1993, an economic cycle has been established, its consequences becoming more severe over time. First, workers are unable to reach their jobs in Israel. Then they cut down on all purchases other than food and essential commodities, hurting retailers, importers, and manufacturers. Across the Strip, people fall behind on their electricity and water bills, and so the municipalities, with their diminishing incomes, pay their employees late, and the Palestinian treasury is unable to collect taxes. People stop traveling inside the Strip, so taxi drivers suffer. So do auto repair shops. They stop paying their minimal health care and school fees and start dipping into savings earmarked for their children's education or for expanding their houses. Gradually, they buy cheaper food and less of it, scouring the markets for low-quality leftovers. Fruit and meat are out of the question. Fruit, said my friend Yusuf, a doctor from the Rafah refugee camp, fruit is like a drug. You don't even dare think about it. Who can pay 7 shekels for 2 pounds of peaches? It's not enough to destroy homes, not enough to destroy jobs. It's not enough to physically injure and kill people. You have to also try to steal their history. And that's what you have to understand about occupation, is that if you allow the occupiers to define who you are and how you remember who you are, then they've won a second time, right? They've already won once by occupying you. But if you allow them to set the terms of the way that you think and you remember, then they are winning again. And that's why Edward Said always said that Palestinians must narrate. They must give themselves permission to narrate, and they must talk about what's going on. Otherwise, they'll forget. Israel's profound need to rewrite Palestinian history was also evident in the identity cards issued to refugees born before 1948. If the cardholder was born in the Gaza Strip, then the space for place of birth was filled in with the name of a specific town or village, such as Khan Yunis or Jabalia. But if the cardholder was born within the borders of what had since become the new Israeli state, then only one word appeared in that space: Israel. The refugee's place of birth had been erased, not only physically, but also in the workings of the Israeli bureaucracy. The new identity cards issued jointly by the Palestinian Authority and Israel replicate this information. Only 2 elements of the document have changed. The Palestinian national colors have been added, and the Hebrew wording now appears beneath the Arabic. According to his identity card, Abu Uni, who comes from Burayr and lives in Shabura, was born in 1930 in Israel, a state that did not yet exist. The PLO leader Abu Mazen was born in Safed in 1933. He too was born in Israel. With a few taps on the keyboard, the Israeli Interior Ministry can enlist every Palestinian refugee in a process that manages to place Israel outside historical time and to divest him of his own history. So even when you look down at your identity card, your place of birth has to be stolen from you and has to be labeled as a place that did not exist in 1933. This is how deep the occupation goes. The occupation even reaches back into history through your identity cards. So there's also the question of imprisonment. I don't want to say that it's a rite of passage for Palestinian men, but it has been made a rite of passage in that if you express resistance to the occupation, you're likely going to be rounded up and you're likely going to be sent to jail, even as a young child. And there is a collective trauma that then spreads across the Palestinian people. Keep in mind, this is trauma on trauma on trauma. So obviously they've already dealt with the trauma from the Nakba, the trauma of not being able to go about your daily lives, to be policed by an occupier, but now the trauma of imprisonment and the subsequent trauma that happens to your family. What happens to your wife and your children while you're away? For all the talk of jail, however, most ex-prisoners say little about the legacy of trauma, precisely because the experience is so common and widespread, and also because Gazans rarely talk about the emotional aspects of their hardships. Palestinians who've spent years with 12 other men in a tiny cell or a leaky tent in the Ansar detention camp are rarely willing to talk about the damage to their spirits, taking pride instead in their maturity and fortitude, in the unity of their group. In conversation, they quickly move on to their new lives, saying how pleased they are to be working. Only very few men will acknowledge the disparity between their successful reintegration into public life and their haunted personal lives, their difficult adjustment to a world that went on without them. "You're not the man I married," Ibrahim Abu Nada's wife told him 3 days after he was released from jail. "The words were like a knife in my soul," Abu Nada confided. But they alerted him to the crisis among his fellow ex-prisoners and their families. "If there are 1,000 prisoners, then there are 1,000 wives who have been hurt," Abu Nada said. He had spent a year in an Israeli jail. Many Gazans have been imprisoned for much longer. Some men yell at their wives, some hit them. Some express their alienation and isolation in long silences. Many spend nights with their friends away from home. Their quick tempers are ignited by the children who find it hard to get along with their fathers. My son doesn't come to me for money. He goes to his mother because that's what he did when I was in prison, S told me with a bitter smile. Unlike Abu Jiab and Mabu, Abu Mustafa needs little encouragement to talk about prison. He was arrested and interrogated several times before the Intifada and was eventually tried for belonging to a Fatah military unit. At every moment, there's something that reminds me of prison. A few days ago, I was watching TV with my daughters and we saw a man hitting a donkey. I made a nervous movement and the girls asked me what was wrong. I was thinking about a time in 1973 when they hit me with a stick. Once they held me for 3 days and hit me with thick electrical wires. It happened 23 years ago, but when I watched television the other day, it all came back to me out of nowhere. Another Fatah member, Abu Majed, and just to make it clear for those of us who don't come from the Arab world and you're wondering, why are these people all called Abu? In the Arabic tradition, you take a name, for women and Abu for men, related to your eldest son's first name. So if you are Abu Majed or Abu Mustafa, your eldest son's name is Mustafa, and you are the father of Mustafa. That first name, I'm hoping I'm remembering this correctly, so please correct me in the comments if I'm wrong here. The first name of the eldest son is usually also the name of the paternal grandfather. So there's a lot of richness in that, which we see also in Russia as well with patronymics. So my name in Russian would be Stepan Stepanovich, right? Because my father was named Stephen, so I'm Stephen, son of Stephen. So here, Abu Majed is the father of Majed. So they're not all named. Their first names are not Abu. It's an honorific. Just a side explanation there. Another Fatah member, Abu Majed, was detained for 6 months when he was 15, and later, during the Intifada, arrested for involvement in the unified national leadership. One Friday, he told me, the Shabak guy took me to the showers. He tied my hand to the shower head, turned on the cold water, and then went home for the weekend. The whole time he was probably with his family, taking his kids on a trip or visiting their grandmother, while I was under the shower with my arm tied above my head. Before this, they tied me up for an hour or two, maybe 5 hours, and the duty officer wouldn't take responsibility for freeing me, so I stayed that way until Saturday night. Then I don't know what happened, but I woke up in the clinic. My arm was paralyzed for a year before I began to move my fingers. My friends had to massage my hand. I still can't use it properly. Every winter it hurts. I can't lift anything. And yet, this is something that I've learned about the Palestinians in studying about them so much, is that even in these dark situations, they manage to look beyond themselves, whether that's to God, whether that's to their family, or even to humor, to get them through the process. So here's an example of when there's a little bit of lightness. I was teaching my friends Hebrew, Abu Mustafa told me, and one of the guards stood by the door listening. When I was finished, he asked where I had learned the language, and we started talking. He was from India, a guy of 26 or 27, different from the others. He treated us all fairly. Soon he was telling me about his little boy, and I showed him pictures of my family. The next day he brought in a cake his wife had made me. It was forbidden, but he did it. We were never really friends, but I was fond of him and learned that there were other kinds of Israelis. They moved him somewhere else when they found out. Abu Majed spoke of guards who already received danger pay but made additional money by smuggling forbidden goods to prisoners for a price. The Israeli I met cares about his wallet. He doesn't give a damn about the rest of Israel. Still, he remembers unexpected moments of contact. One of his interrogators was rather overweight. As the man was jumping on him and squeezing his testicles, trying to get him to squeal on his comrades, Abu Majed managed to gasp, "They must be paying you double for your fat ass." Incredibly, the interrogator bent over with laughter and left the room. So, as I said, managing to get a little bit of humor. Um, and another sort of unbelievable, wonderful story. As I say, contradictions. You wish things were black and white, but there's so much gray here in prison. It seems some soldiers and prisoners developed friendships, and their stories have become occupation folklore. There is the soldier who wanted an ex-prisoner from Gaza to attend his wedding, but the strip was under curfew. So the soldier recruited other soldiers, his friends, on a mission. They stole into Gaza in an army jeep, collected the Palestinian friend from his home in the Khan Yunis camp, covered his head with a blanket as they approached the checkpoint. "Where are you going with him?" the checkpoint guards asked, indicating the Palestinian. The soldiers in the jeep said in whispers, "It's okay, we're taking him in for interrogation." So I'm laughing because here was a moment of connection, of humanity shared between these people, and yet it has to be done in such a way. Um, it just These are the stories that only a journalist can tell if the Palestinians are not allowed to tell their own stories, and it's wonderful to hear. So we've talked about a war on the economy, on the jobs, on families, on houses. What about the effects on the health of the Gazans? Talking about access to drinking water. Families that don't have lucky relatives or public taps in their neighborhoods, or that can't afford special trips to a source of sweet water, that is, most families, risk the unsanitary water from their taps or drink very little. The reason, I think, why so many people in Gaza have constant headaches. A report compiled by the European Community found that the amount of chloride in Gaza's water exceeds 200 milligrams per liter, the upper limit permissible in drinking water, through most of the strip. The chloride levels range between 200 and 1,000 milligrams per liter, and in the eastern part of the strip, they exceed 1,000. I mean, most of us can't even imagine water with that much chloride in it. And what's worse is understanding, and I talked about this in one of my very earliest reviews, in which I talked about the fact that Mercarot, particularly in the West Bank, the Israeli water company, just steals water from the Palestinians. And here, again, we see the numbers behind that. While the aquifers of the West Bank and Israel supply an estimated 580 to 830 million cubic meters annually, West Bank Palestinians consume between 110 and 133 million cubic meters of that water, or only 15 to 20% of the supply originating in the region. The rest is transferred to Jewish settlers and residents in Israel. In other words, the whole country's water supply is considered a common shared resource for Israelis. But when Palestinian consumption is at issue, the 1967 borders are suddenly reinstated, and those same common resources are off limits to Gazans, who are expected to subsist on the limited supply from the local aquifer. This is another crime which we know from occupation, is stealing water from the people that you're occupying. The people of the Strip have long suffered from widespread ill health triggered by emotional tension, high blood pressure, respiratory infections, headaches. With each new hermetic closure, these conditions worsen, according to Rabba Mohana, the head of the Union of Health Work Committees, a network of non-governmental clinics set up by the DFLP and PFLP before the Intifada. As many as 60% of Gaza's children suffer from anemia, and 90% from intestinal parasites. 90%. Treating parasites involves treating the whole family, but when the borders are sealed, the family cannot afford to buy the medicine. And what happens when your family is ill and you want to visit them? So Amira, in this particular case, gives us one case study in which she walks us through all the challenges that happen. It's a long excerpt, but I have to read it to you so that you understand what these families are going through. That same Thursday evening, I visited the mother, bringing the documents, the pajamas, and a kiss from her daughter. I was shocked to see her looking so frail and thin, while her legs were badly swollen. "When will my children come?" she whispered. "What about my son? I want to see my children." I brought her a little water and plumped up her pillows. 2 days later, on Saturday, I returned at the request of the daughters. The mother had been moved to a different room, and I found her connected to various tubes. A team of doctors surrounded her bed. "Where's the family?" one doctor asked me. "This woman won't live through the day." I called the daughters, telling them to run to the Civilian Liaison Committee office and demand permits immediately, even though the Israeli CLO was closed on Saturdays. Next, I contacted the regional IDF spokesperson and was put through to a CLO representative who took the family's particulars and promised that the permits would be delivered to the Erez checkpoint right away. So the father and daughters were allowed to leave, but not to stay overnight. Still, the father spent several hours with his wife and hurried back to Gaza before his permit expired. All of this by taxi, since cars bearing Gaza license plates are not allowed out of the strip. A decided to risk staying the night. The eldest daughter, M, who lives in the West Bank, had no exit permit but found a way to steal across the border. I offered these illegals my apartment in Tel Aviv to sleep, or at least rest for a few hours during the day. That evening, the mother showed signs of improvement. There is no doubt her family's visit gave her strength. Over the next few days, the family fought for permits and ferried back and forth between Gaza and Tel Aviv. The eldest daughter stayed at her mother's bedside, an enemy infiltrator breaking the law. 1 week after entering the hospital, the mother slipped into a coma, and the whole family, save the son, G, simply ignored regulations and spent the night at her side. A relative with connections and influence in Palestinian intelligence, I believe, managed to arrange retroactive permits, including permission to stay in Israel overnight. Then G began his odyssey to leave the strip. Surprisingly, he was able to receive a magnetic card, a prerequisite for a single man of his age, without trouble. He submitted a request to enter Israel, attaching a letter from the hospital describing his mother's condition, but was told he already had a permit. The CLO had confused his name with his father's. When the mistake was cleared up, he was promised a permit for the following day. But before G could reach the hospital, his mother died. Bringing her body directly back to Gaza for burial meant securing a driver's permit and supplying the registration number of the Gaza municipal vehicle that transports the dead and is allowed to enter Israel for that purpose. A driver was located, but he was denied permission to cross into Israel. Until a second driver was found, several hours had passed and the family decided to wait no longer. The body was brought back to Gaza in an Israeli ambulance for transfer to a local Palestinian vehicle, a procedure people preferred to avoid if they could. When the ambulance reached the Erez checkpoint, a Palestinian policeman approached the IDF soldier on duty and explained the circumstances. Special permission was required for the two ambulances to meet on one side of the checkpoint. The soldier called his superiors at the CLO and asked for the green light, using a common Erez phrase to describe shifting goods from an Israeli truck to a Palestinian one. "I need to transfer a body back to back," he said. Mercifully, permission was granted, but yet more prohibitions prevented the family from being together at the funeral and during the mourning period. M, the eldest daughter, was allowed to cross from the West Bank into Gaza. Her husband, also a native of Gaza, wanted to attend the burial and stay with his wife's family during the mourning period, but his request was turned down. He was denied permission to leave the West Bank for security reasons, but no one knew what those were. The man had never been arrested and was still living in an area directly controlled by the Israeli army, which could long since have detained him had he truly posed a security threat. So you can see, unbelievably, even in death, you're going to have to deal with permits. So it's not enough that the IDF would control you until you die, that even when you die and you're trying to get buried, Israel is still trying to control how you get in and how you get out, and can your family go to your burial. And so you can see that because of the occupation, Palestinians have held onto their family even closer. Already, Arabs are legendary for having attachment to their family. But if you could say that the occupation has almost supercharged this in a way that their attachment to family is almost unbreakable. And we saw this in Hassan Kanafani's short stories, particularly that letter from Gaza, in which he says, "Come back, don't go away to America, we miss you." In Gaza, there's nothing but sand and children, I was told by a Jabalia native doing sociological research. He complained that even the younger, modern couples went on having one child after another. Along with my growing wonder at Gazans' staying power, I began to understand an underlying reason for their extraordinary familial devotion. They clung steadfastly to family, to respect for the eldest members, and to having large numbers of children as a bulwark, like religion, against the instability and lack of continuity in their lives. Since 1948, they have been subject to upheaval, to sweeping political changes over which they have no control, to economic uncertainty, and to the constant shadow of sudden, violent death, especially once the Intifada began in 1987. Much has been said about how the Intifada undermined adult authority, but it is also true that the crushing oppression and daily violence heightened the need to seek consolation among family members, to use the home to counterbalance the crumbling social framework outside. Soon after the transfer of authority, I was in a bicycle shop on Al Wada Street in the commercial center of Gaza City. The salesman admitted to me that his brother, the owner, had him work there only so he would feel that he was earning his keep, so that he would not feel ashamed to accept his brother's financial support. Very few customers came into the store, even during the summer. In that working-class neighborhood, parents couldn't afford to indulge their children with bicycles. Next door was a modest restaurant. During the 2 hours I sat there, the busy period just after noon, only one person came in to buy a kebab sandwich. "I'm living entirely off my brother," said the man behind the counter, echoing the bicycle salesman. "And my brother can't save anything for his own family because he spends whatever he has on me and my children." So there is a form of welfare within Gaza, which is just family. There's no government handouts. It's just people taking care of each other and people still wanting to have a little bit of pride. They're given these, I don't want to call them fake jobs, but they both acknowledge that, hey, I want to help you out in some way. Yes, you're working in my bicycle shop, but there's no bicycles to sell. But at least he can have some kind of dignity and show some kind of solidarity. There's also, of course, special words related to Gazans, that Gazans will use words that may not be used in other parts of Palestine. Certain words, too, have been turned around and become weighted with significance. The word hijra, used to describe the expulsion and flight from the villages, is also the word for the Prophet Muhammad's journey from Mecca to Medina. According to the historian Albert Hirani, the word has not simply the negative meaning of a flight from Mecca, but the positive one of seeking protection by settling in a place other than one's own. In later Islamic periods, it would be used to mean the abandonment of a pagan or wicked community for one living in accordance with the moral teachings of Islam. But in deeply Islamic Gaza, ironically, the word hijra has no positive connotations, except to the extent that it spares the Israeli listener the loaded word Nakba, or catastrophe, which Palestinians use when talking about 1948. Which is interesting that she's an Israeli Jew in the room, and they'll use a word like hijra instead of using the word Nakba, which gives you a sense of how strong, quote unquote, the word Nakba sounds to an Israeli. For us, outside of this situation, when we think about it, we just think about it as a word that refers to a historical event, but it has a very strong sense, as you can see from this passage. The word inside has also been upended. The land within Israel's 1967 borders, including all the Palestinian cities and villages, is referred to as inside, partly as a way to avoid saying Israel's name, but also because of the geopolitical fact that up until 1967, all the refugees from inside the borders lived outside them. But inside remained in use after 1967 and is still the common term, even since the practice of sealing up the strip became regular policy in 1991. People ask, when are you going back inside? Meaning inside those borders. When are you leaving for inside? Or even, I'd love to get out and go inside with you. In a 147 square mile ribbon of land with no exit, inside has become synonymous with wide open spaces. So after giving us the Palestinian perspective on all this, how do the Israelis see it? How do the Jews see things? Haas gives us some sense of that. Israel's misreading of Palestinian intentions is rooted in its own illusions, in Israeli society's skewed grasp of reality, whereby it fails to recognize its clear superiority in every sphere: military, economic, educational, and technological. Inherited and manipulated fear, the perception of oneself as the perennial victim, and the primordial Jewish dread of the Gentile are projected onto the other people who live in the same country. In this light, all Palestinian behavior is explained in terms of past Jewish experience, and Islamic religious texts and manifestations are interpreted accordingly as the expression of fanatics only. I began to learn something about us Israelis too, something not quite obvious in the cafes and parks of Tel Aviv. Large numbers of my compatriots, I came to realize, were hard at work devising ways to stop people from leaving the Strip and spinning sophisticated security arguments to justify their actions. And many more, those who paid daily lip service to the transformations of peace, preferred not to disturb the status quo by challenging the siege of Gaza. It was hard not to think of a remark I once heard from Ihab al-Ashkar. "The trouble with you Israelis," he said, "is that you think we just weren't made the same way you are." I.e., also human beings. Every Gazan, regardless of religion, sex, or age, became suspect, a person capable of committing an act of terror. But like every occupation force before it, Israel, despite having controlled the territory since 1967, had still not learned that resistance and terror are responses to occupation itself and to the form of terror embodied by the foreign ruler. Nor had it learned to distinguish between such acts of resistance as throwing stones or shooting at soldiers within the occupied territories and killing citizens inside Israel's international borders. Both sets of manifestations were seen as one virus that could infect the Palestinian population indiscriminately. Although the PLO had pledged in 1994 to renounce violence and only a small segment of Palestinians continued to carry out random acts, Israel persisted in ignoring the distinction. And this is a point 4 from a letter to Amira in which she was pursuing a case. And point 4, "To my regret, we do not consider you an objective journalist who is guided by the truth, and we do not see our way clear to respond to you in detail in the future either, given our bitter experience with your negative attitude, an approach that even Palestinian journalists have not adopted in their work." And this is something that you'll see over and over again, not just in comments on these videos, but from the Israeli press, that if you say anything negative about Israel, you are considered not an objective journalist who is guided by the truth. And the reality has to be, what has Israel ever done wrong? And please explain why. This is one of my tests for Zionists, people who are self-proclaimed Zionists who say that Israel is the greatest thing ever. And I have to say, just could you tell me one thing Israel has ever done wrong and tell me why it was wrong? And I have yet to be answered. I asked this to a commenter the other day. Could you tell me one thing? And he says, there's lots of things. And I said, just name one thing. The whole issue is an inability to see an attack on Israel as separate from an attack on Jewish people. And this is something that we're seeing very much in the news today as this video is coming out, that they're trying to conflate the two things. That Israel has to be representative of the Jewish people. So if you attack Israel, you are attacking Jews. But that's not the case. There are plenty of Islamic countries. So if you're attacking the policies of Saudi Arabia, it does not mean that you're attacking Arabs. If you're attacking the policies of France, it does not mean that you're attacking white people. You have to be able to distinguish the two. And as long as Zionists want to use that cover, we're never going to get anywhere, because Israel is a terrorist state that is capable of being questioned, and it has nothing to do with Jewish people, except the Jews who want to support a terrorist state. And yes, that's on you. In any case, that's the end of part 1, which, as I said, is the realities of the occupation. In part 2, I'm going to go on to talk about intra-Palestinian struggles. How are the Palestinians dealing with each other inside the Strip, given the stresses of the occupation, and given the different demands and leadership that is trying to hold the people together. As always, if you enjoyed this, please hit like, hit subscribe, share this with somebody who's open-minded enough to want to really learn more about the situation instead of just watching the news and being told what to think. You can also buy a copy of the book. There's a link in the description. That's another way you can support this channel. Another way you can support this channel, if you'd like, really like this work is becoming a patron. There you can get early releases to these videos, chat with me about questions that you have, learn from other people who are members. You can also become a YouTube member if you'd like to do that. And remember that a portion of the proceeds from any of these types of revenue streams into the channel are going to go to the Palestine Children's Relief Fund in 2024. That's my focus charity for this year. They help Palestinian children get medical care when they otherwise couldn't. And if you're thinking about 2025, because as I say, 2024 is pretty taken up with the Palestine-Israel issue, you can look at my Amazon wish list, which is also linked below, and you can pick out a book, buy it for me, and I might be able to review it next year, just not this year. And if you'd like to talk with me more in between these book reviews, you can see I post daily here in YouTube, posting maps and quotes, and I also interact a lot on X. And the link to my account is there as well. Until next time, enjoy your reading.